The M3 name is one of the most recognisable there is in the car world, one with one of the most legendary histories behind it. Just look at this, for instance, the E46 CSL, a car that many consider to be the best driving M3 of all time. But if you wanted something more track-focused to annihilate lap times at the Nürburgring, you'd go for this, the E92 M3 GTS, a car I properly like, especially in that orange. Then there was the car that started it all. It is the E30 M3, built for homologation purposes to go racing in touring cars. And as you may have heard, there's a new version and it's causing a bit of a stir. And today we're going to drive it. But before I get into the review, remember to hit the like button and subscribe for more awesome videos just like this one. Wow, now that I see it up close, it's much bigger than I expected. Just the overall design change is so much bigger than I was expecting, and you don't really realise it until you see the car in the skin. Take the front end, for instance. You've got these really defined lines going up the bonnet here and all the way down here that gives the car such an aggressive look compared to its predecessors. And then there are these small little indents on the bonnet that in some pictures look a bit like vents, but they're actually just small dents in the bonnet, again, to make this look properly angry. Then lower down, we've got these kind of vents around here which actually function and are carbon fibre, so they look properly sleek, with this kind of splitter that wraps around here that just gives the car such a mean look. We've also got carbon fibre around here, and then we've got a vent here that, yes, absolutely functions, so air does pass through here and wraps around the wheels. This is a controversial one. These side vents aren't actually side vents. They're actually completely fake. They're plastic coverings. And I think some people will get really distressed by that because they'll think that their car is an aerodynamic weapon. And it is in pretty much every other respect, but here, it's just completely fake. I think it's time we address the elephant in the room, though. This colour is extremely bold, because car manufacturers never launch new cars in green, apart from Aston Martin, because they're always going for something that's more vibrant and crazy, a bit like the highlighter yellow M4 behind me. But this car here in Isle of Man green is absolutely stunning. And it was very brave of BMW to do that. You know, BMW doesn't make that many brave decisions, but I think this new M3 is certainly quite a move into the unknown. Lots of carbon fibre, very aggressive looks, and I think there are some elements that are going to be quite controversial, but I think I've covered just about everything. So if you want your performance car to have 4 doors, you go for the M3, but if you're after the more sporty look, you go for the 2-door M4. And there were some subtle differences in looks between the old M4 and the M3, particularly at the back of the car, but they're almost pretty much identical. If you come round and take a look at the rest of the car, understandably, we've got a much bigger driver and passenger door, no rear set here, and also the roofline drops off in a more coupe-like fashion. But that's about the only real difference at the side of the car. The lines are pretty much the same, the front end is pretty much identical, and also the rear is pretty much the same as well. So on the old M4, you had more of a almost like a ducktail sculpted into the bonnet, but that's not really the case on this new version. I think I prefer the look of the old car in all fairness, although it is touched off nicely with this carbon fibre wing available on the competition. And that's another thing to bear in mind. There are 2 forms of M3 and M4 you can buy, a regular M3 and M4 and a competition version, but in the UK you can only buy the competitions. Now, I've had to come outside with our test car because the ones we were looking at back in the studio were locked due to COVID restrictions. But this one I can open up. So if we take a look at the boot, which is power assisted, we've got 480 litres of storage. And if you go for the M4, it's a little bit smaller at 440. Now, I mean, it doesn't really matter. It is absolutely gigantic. You can chuck loads of stuff in there. It'll take easily 2, if not more, massive suitcases. There's no underfloor storage though, and if there is, BMW don't want you to access it because there's no way to lift up the floor. However, you've got 2 pockets either side of the boot. One containing a first aid kit, and the other is BMW's good old-fashioned toolkit. This is such an advanced car, I don't really know what you can do on the go, but I guess if you've got a puncture, the BMW toolkit is here to save you. Underneath this super sculpted bonnet is BMW's new S58 generation twin-turbo inline-6 engine. Now, as I mentioned earlier, all UK cars are competition spec, and that means they produce 503 brake horsepower and 650 Newton meters of torque. Now, at launch, you'll get this car as a rear-wheel drive only, but a little later on, you'll also be able to get an all-wheel drive X-Drive version, which should make it super snappy in a straight line. Now, all competition cars come with an 8-speed automatic gearbox, and in a straight line, this thing will go from 0 to 62 in 3.9 seconds. However, there is also a non-competition version. Now, it uses the same engine, although it produces 473 brake horsepower. Now, that one, so annoyingly, is also available with a manual gearbox, but BMW isn't bringing it to the UK, which is such a crying shame, because I think that would probably be the car to go for. Either way, it's a little bit slower to 60, taking 4.2 seconds, but still, want that manual shift. Now, getting into the M3 or M4 is a bit like stepping into a racing car, which I love because I'm essentially a grown-up kid and I love pretending that I'm a GT driver. But that brings me on to the prices, and it's quite expensive. So the M3 starts at around about £75,000 and the M4 is just a bit more expensive at 76. But that's before you add options. So one of the cheapest options you can do is the Comfort Pack, which adds such luxuries as an electrically assisted boot lid. But if you want these awesome bucket seats, you'll be looking at the Carbon Pack, which comes in at just shy of £7,000. If you want beefier brakes, carbon ceramics, that's an £8,000 option. But there is a pack that includes pretty much everything, called the Ultimate Pack, and that's £11,000. But you know what it doesn't include? Those carbon ceramics. So if you want the full fat M3 or 4, you could spend nearly £100,000. Of course, you could always head over to YesAuto.com and find great deals on new and used M3s and M4s, so you might be able to save yourself a bit of money over there. Now, of course, this is pretty much a fully loaded car, so we've got carbon all around the centre console, on the steering wheel as well, and a bit on the dashboard, and of course we've got these glorious bucket seats. I've seen some people say they're not very comfortable, but honestly, these are some of the nicest buckets I've ever been in. Really great grip around your waist, and if you are flinging this thing about, you are kept in position. Perfect for putting in some lap times around the Nordschleife. We've got a typically chunky BMW M wheel, but it doesn't actually feel as big as some of the other models I've been on. Not nearly as nice as some of the performance wheels from like the VW group, like what you get on a Porsche or Audi RS products, but it does the job very nicely. And we've also got these carbon fibre paddles behind the steering wheel, and I think it all adds up to this feeling of the M3 being a lot more grown up than before. It feels like a properly luxurious car in here, almost like a slightly smaller version of an M8 Grand Coupe. And it should really, with over £10,000 worth of options and a price tag with all of that in combined, coming to nearly 100 grand. Now, in the centre of the dash, we have this nice big infotainment screen, and it's pretty much exactly the same as what you'd get on a 3 Series or pretty much anything else, including a nice row of physical buttons for things like the heater and also the climate settings. But being an M product, we also have a special M menu. Now, what we can do here is actually have some different custom settings. So on the steering wheel, I've got 2 buttons, one which says M1 and M2, and you can program them with different profiles. So when you start the car up, you could have that as neutral mode. You could then program, say, M1 for a slightly more warmed up mode, and then an M2, you could just have the most insane setting. So if I go into configure M1 now, what we can do is change the way the engine responds. So we've got Sport, Sport Plus, transmission. My goodness, you've got so many different ones to choose from here. You've got regular drive and then also a Sport version. Chassis, we can do Sport Plus. Steering, already in Sport, which has a bit more weight. And you can also change the brakes, which is quite an important thing because we did a little drive of this earlier and the brakes will be quite grabby. Now you'll see that come up quite a lot. I use my hands a lot when describing stuff. Some people like it, some people don't. But we've got gesture controls in here. So if I wanted to turn up the volume on the radio, just by moving my hands, I can basically turn things up or turn things down. Which is absolutely fine if you're driving by yourself and you want to do that. But if you're talking to somebody and you're a little bit Latin like I am and have to move your hands around, then it can be a real pain in the backside. Now that's all partnered up with a really nice digital cockpit. I really like the ones that you get in these BMWs. Really clear, very, very colourful. But also what we can do is not only just view our speed and also RPM, but that you can also customize the center of it. So let's say if I wanted to see the sat nav, you could have the main sat nav there and then also have kind of a more zoomed in version dead in front of you. And if you've got a head-up display, you'll also see it on there as well. Now, being based on the 3 Series, it's really spacious back here in the M3. So I've got loads of legroom, even with the driver's seat in my position. And headroom isn't too bad, although I think if you're 6 foot, it might be a little bit cramped if you were to sit up straight. Now, this obviously being the saloon is a bit more spacious back here. So let's go and check out the M4 and see what that's like. By comparison, the M4 is a bit tighter, so legroom is still really good, but headroom I've probably only got like a millimetre or 2 still to go, and that's because we've got this coupe roofline. But you don't buy the M4 for its practicality, you buy it for its looks, so you should kind of expect it to be a bit more cramped back here. So the M4 is a bit more cramped, but you've got climate settings in the back of both cars, as well as 2 USB-C chargers. So the back of both cars is really a very nice place to be if you're on a long journey, particularly if you've got this lovely glossy carbon fibre to look at on the sports seats. With me and performance cars lately. When I drove the Cyan, it was chucking it down with rain. 808 brake horsepower on that day was a little bit on the scary side. If you haven't seen that review, by the way, go click the link in the top right hand corner. I've got miserable conditions with the M3. However, a slippery surface, over 500 horsepower and rear wheel drive actually sounds like a recipe for a lot of fun. Wow, it's a slippery day today, even just pulling onto a motorway. I can feel the back end stepping out a little bit. This is a very silly car. So I'm on the motorway right now, and we've got to bear in mind that the M3 isn't just a performance car, it's also really versatile. It's got to work as an everyday runabout, and for the most part, it's much more relaxing and comfortable in here than when it is when you're on a road. It is still a little bit on the firm side though, and going over a few bumps, you definitely get launched into the air a little bit. But it is very good at winding itself back. If I take off the M modes, the throttle response becomes a little softer and the brakes aren't quite as bitey when they're in comfort mode. If you put it in one of the M modes and in your driver setting that has the brakes in sport mode, they can be quite bitey even on a motorway, but if you have it in comfort, this car becomes a bit more 3 Series. Not completely like a 3 Series, but not far off. What do you think of the noise? Even the old car didn't sound nearly as good as something like an E46. And BMW did synthesize a lot of the sound, but even on the outside, that thing sounded all right-ish, but I would say on this new car, the sound is properly underwhelming. And while the gear shift is really good, this 8-speed automatic gearbox is magnificent, don't get me wrong. And with these paddles, it feels really good shifting through the gears. But I wish there was a blip of the throttle on downshift. So sometimes when you shove it into its sportier setting, you just want it to kind of blip when pulling up to a set of traffic lights or something like that, but it just doesn't do it. It feels a little bit on the tame side. What's really impressive though is the steering. It's just so ridiculously responsive. Any kind of input, even right in the center, the smallest movement, and the car reacts. It just feels razor sharp. But in these conditions, you can really throw the nose in. But even with just the smallest amount of throttle, the back end is wanting to spin up. This thing is just a lunatic. M3s are known for being a little on the harsh side. And this thing is no different. It is really very firm. What I find a bit strange though is I find all the bumps and grooves are being translated really well through the car. Now that makes it actually quite frustrating as a daily driver, but as a performance car, that's what you want. You want to be able to feel the road surface. Crucially though, I can't feel it through the wheel. So even though the steering rack is really direct and very responsive, the steering itself is still a little bit numb. It's much better than what you get on something like an Audi or a Merc, but I really can't feel the road surface through the wheel. I can feel it through everything else but the steering wheel, and that's really where I need to feel it the most. So I think now might be a good point to throw over to the M4 and see what that's like. Now, as we had the M4 as well, I thought probably a good idea if we jump in and give it a go and see if it's any different to the M3. BMW has really tried to keep the M3 and 4 really close together this time, so really if you want that performance experience but need an extra set of doors, you just go for the M3. Yeah, even with its traction control on, this is still a very, very leery car. It's just the joy of having something that's rear-wheel drive. You know, in all fairness, it feels pretty much just identical to the M3, but that's kind of what we were expecting. There might be some subtle differences on track because this is a bit lighter, but we're not, unfortunately, on track at the moment. And, you know, I don't see it as being a bad thing if they both feel pretty much exactly the same. What I will say, though, is the M4 feels a bit more GT than before. It's always been this muscly sports car, but now I kind of feel like I'm in a baby M8. You definitely feel like you're in a bigger product. It definitely feels like a bigger car. So anyway, that's my quick impression of the M4. Feels pretty much exactly the same as the M3. Maybe some small differences on track, but from what I can feel at the moment, they're identical. Back to the M3. We're back from the M4, and it'll come as no big surprise that they actually handle pretty much exactly the same, which is a great thing. If you want the car with 4 doors, you get the M3. If you want the car with 2 doors, you get the M4. So I'm going to go through the things I like and the things I'm not so keen on with the new M3. First of all, I don't think the looks are nearly as bad as the pictures suggest. When you see this thing in the metal, particularly in black like we had on the M4, it looks astounding. It's got such a presence to it. And you find there are so many cars out there at the moment, your AMGs and your RSs, that are a little bit on the boring side. Yes, this is controversial, but I do think it looks pretty cool. The second thing is the steering. I just think this is so precise. It feels like a real precision weapon, and I can't wait to drive this on track. It's a little bit difficult to exploit it fully on the road, particularly on a wet day. I don't want to go binning this in the hedges, but it's just begging to be drifted, particularly with how slippery the rear end is, even with traction control on. And the third thing is just how much of an improved product this feels like. It feels like a proper luxury item now. which it should do at the price it costs. The things I'm not a fan of, the ride's a tad firm. Okay, a lot of BMW M buyers are used to that, but it doesn't feel like much of an improvement in here. It's still quite a solid ride. The next thing is the steering again. Again, very, very precise, really quick, just lacking the feel that I'm after. And third is the sound of the exhaust. I just wish it was a bit noisier, just a bit nicer. I think there's a lot of potential here, but I still think there's a little bit of work to do on the drive, and also with the steering, I would like a little bit more feel, particularly from a BMW.